Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into one of the most brutal survival challenges medieval peasants faced: finding shelter when on the road, especially with no money or status to call their own. This was a time without hotels or hostels, where the poorest peasants had to rely on their wits, community, and sometimes sheer luck to find a safe place to rest. What fascinates me about this topic is how this seemingly simple problem was actually a complex challenge involving social customs, religious charity, and the harsh realities of medieval travel. We're talking about people who had to navigate a world where being poor and on the road made you simultaneously vulnerable and unwelcome. So hit that like button if you're ready for some seriously engaging history, and drop a comment letting me know your thoughts. I genuinely love hearing from you all. Get comfortable, maybe appreciate the roof over your head a little more after this, and let's walk through the muddy paths of medieval roads, where shelter was more than just comfort. It was survival. Picture this. You're a peasant in the 14th century, tasked with a journey that could last days or even weeks. You have no money, no formal invitations, and the roads are dangerous and unpredictable. The inns and lodging houses you might encounter aren't signs of luxury. They're risky places, often overrun with thieves, rats, or worse. Bedbugs and fleas are unwelcome companions, and safety is never guaranteed. You're basically walking into a world where every night could be your last if you make the wrong choice about where to rest. The reality was absolutely brutal. Many poor peasants traveled for market days, seasonal labor, or to fulfill feudal obligations, but had nowhere reliable to stay. The constant threat of robbery, wild animals, and exposure meant that finding shelter was as much about luck as it was about planning. Unlike wealthy merchants who could afford protection and proper accommodations, poor peasants were completely on their own. They had to develop survival skills that would make modern backpackers look like amateurs. One of the cruel ironies is that the very people who needed shelter most were often the least welcome. Wealthy landowners and townsfolk feared poor travelers as potential thieves or disease carriers. Many inns or monasteries would turn away beggars and the destitute, leaving peasants to sleep under hedges or in barns, often in miserable conditions. The social stigma of being poor and traveling made you automatically suspicious, even when you were just trying to survive. What really gets me is the psychological and physical toll of such travel. Sleep deprivation, exposure to cold or rain, and constant fear of attack created a nightmare scenario that could break even the strongest person. Traveling alone was dangerous because you were an easy target, but traveling in groups was logistically complicated and could attract unwanted attention from bandits or authorities. Every decision about where to sleep was a calculated risk that could mean the difference between life and death. The seasonal aspect made everything worse. Winter travel was essentially a death sentence for poor peasants, but sometimes they had no choice. Spring and summer brought their own challenges: overcrowded roads during harvest season, disease outbreaks in crowded accommodations, and competition for limited shelter options. Peasants had to become amateur meteorologists and social strategists, timing their journeys to maximize their chances of finding safe shelter. But here's what absolutely amazes me. The resilience and innovation peasants showed in the face of these impossible circumstances. They developed secret knowledge of safe spots, relied on networks of charity, and sometimes bartered labor or goods for shelter. This wasn't just about survival. It was about navigating a social landscape that was often actively hostile to their existence. They created informal support systems that functioned despite the lack of official help. The gender dynamics added another layer of complexity. Women traveling alone faced additional dangers and were often viewed with even more suspicion than men. Families traveling together had to protect children while managing the logistics of finding group shelter. Elderly or disabled peasants faced nearly impossible odds, often depending entirely on the kindness of strangers or family networks. What's really fascinating is how this whole shelter crisis shaped medieval culture and social norms. The concept of hospitality became a moral imperative, partly because everyone understood how dangerous it was to be caught without shelter. Religious institutions developed charity systems, partly in response to the desperate need for traveler accommodation. Even the layout of medieval towns and villages was influenced by the need to provide some form of emergency shelter. The economic impact was huge too. Poor peasants who couldn't afford proper accommodation often arrived at their destinations exhausted, sick, or unable to work effectively. This created a cycle where poverty made travel more dangerous, which made it harder to improve their economic situation. Some peasants became professional travelers, developing expertise in finding shelter that they could share with others for payment or favors. Finally, the idea that travel was a privilege only accessible to the wealthy is completely challenged by medieval reality. Poor peasants traveled despite incredible obstacles, showing a kind of courage and determination that we often overlook in our romanticized view of medieval life. This story frames medieval travel as not just physical movement, but a navigation of social and economic survival that required incredible skill and bravery. Get ready to dive deeper into these shelters and the social systems that made such journeys barely possible in our upcoming sections. Now we're diving into the fascinating world of medieval shelter networks. And honestly, this is where the story gets really interesting, because we're talking about a complex web of religious duty, commercial opportunity, and social obligation that kept desperate peasants alive. What absolutely blows my mind is how these supposedly dark ages actually had sophisticated systems for helping travelers, even if they were inconsistent and sometimes dangerous. We're looking at monasteries that operated like medieval hostels, inns that ranged from lifesavers to death traps, and creative makeshift accommodations that showed incredible human ingenuity. The variety of shelter options available to poor peasants was actually way more diverse than most people realize. The monastery system was honestly the medieval equivalent of a social safety net, and it's amazing how this worked in practice. Most monasteries had a formal obligation to provide hospitality to travelers, regardless of their social status or ability to pay. This wasn't just charity, it was a religious commandment that took the biblical instruction to welcome strangers seriously. Peasants could show up at monastery gates and expect at least basic shelter, usually in a dedicated guest house or dormitory. The quality varied wildly, but it was often the most reliable option for poor travelers. But here's where it gets really interesting. Monasteries weren't just providing beds out of pure altruism. They were also gathering information, maintaining political connections, and sometimes recruiting new members. Travelers brought news from other regions, trade opportunities, and connections to the outside world that isolated religious communities desperately needed. Some monasteries became unofficial information hubs, where peasants could learn about road conditions, political situations, and opportunities in distant areas. The inn system was way more complex than the simple medieval hotel picture most people have. Inns ranged from relatively decent establishments run by respectable families to absolute nightmare places that were basically fronts for criminal operations. Poor peasants had to become expert at reading the signs, which inns were safe, which ones would rob you, and which ones might let you sleep in the stables in exchange for work. The reputation of an inn could spread for miles, and peasants developed informal networks for sharing information about safe accommodations. What's really fascinating is how creative peasants got with alternative accommodations. Churches often allowed travelers to sleep in the nave overnight, especially during bad weather. Wealthy households sometimes provided shelter in exchange for labor. You could work in the kitchen or stables during the day and sleep in the servants' quarters at night. Some peasants even arranged to sleep in workshops or storage areas, bartering their skills for a roof over their heads. The seasonal variation in shelter availability was incredible. During harvest time, peasants could often find accommodation with farming families who needed extra workers. Market days created opportunities to sleep in merchant stalls or warehouses. Religious festivals opened up additional church-based accommodations. Smart peasants learned to time their travel around these seasonal opportunities, essentially following a calendar of shelter availability. But the dangers were real and constant. Some inns were notorious for drugging guests and robbing them, or worse. Shared accommodations meant exposure to diseases, fleas, and sometimes violent conflicts with other travelers. Even monastery hospitality could be withdrawn if you were suspected of being a heretic, criminal, or political enemy. Peasants had to constantly evaluate whether potential shelter was worth the risk. The gender dynamics around shelter were particularly complex. Women traveling alone faced additional dangers and were often segregated into separate accommodations. Some monasteries had different rules for male and female travelers, and women often had to seek shelter in convents rather than monasteries. This created additional logistical challenges, as convents were less common and often more restrictive about who they would admit. What really impresses me is how peasants developed survival strategies around these shelter networks. They learned to carry references or recommendations from previous hosts, essentially creating medieval versions of travel reviews. Some peasants specialized in particular routes, building relationships with specific monasteries or innkeepers that could provide reliable shelter. Others developed skills that made them welcome everywhere: storytelling, basic medical knowledge, or craft abilities that hosts valued. The economic relationships were fascinating too. Many peasants couldn't pay for accommodation with money, but they could offer services, goods, or information. A peasant might repair tools, help with cooking, or share news from distant regions in exchange for shelter. Some became informal messengers, carrying letters or small items between locations in return for accommodation. This created a complex barter economy around travel and shelter. The quality of accommodations varied wildly, depending on location and circumstance. Monastery guest houses might provide clean straw beds and simple meals, while inn accommodations could range from private rooms to shared spaces with dozens of other travelers. Some peasants became skilled at quickly assessing accommodation quality and knowing when to move on versus when to stay. What's really striking is how these shelter networks created informal communities among traveling peasants. People would share information about safe accommodations, warn each other about dangerous areas, and sometimes travel together for mutual protection. The shared experience of seeking shelter created bonds that transcended normal social boundaries. The long-term impact of these shelter systems was huge. They enabled economic mobility, seasonal labor migration, and cultural exchange that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Peasants who mastered the art of finding shelter could access opportunities far from their home villages, potentially improving their economic situation. These networks also spread ideas, techniques, and innovations across medieval Europe in ways that shaped the entire culture. Now we're getting to the really gritty part: how peasants actually survived when formal shelter wasn't available. And honestly, this is where their creativity and resourcefulness really shine. We're talking about people who had to master the art of sleeping rough, sharing cramped spaces with strangers, and bartering their way into temporary safety, using nothing but their wits and whatever skills they possessed. What absolutely fascinates me about this topic is how these supposedly simple medieval peasants developed sophisticated survival strategies that would make modern homeless advocates take notes. They turned desperation into innovation, creating informal support networks that functioned despite having no official backing or resources. The art of sleeping rough was way more complex than just finding a spot to lie down. Peasants had to become expert at reading terrain, weather patterns, and potential dangers. A good sleeping spot needed to be hidden from bandits, protected from rain and wind, close enough to water, but not so close that you'd be attacked by wild animals. They learned to look for natural shelters like rock overhangs, dense thickets, or abandoned buildings that could provide some protection. The most experienced travelers could assess a potential campsite in minutes, evaluating everything from drainage to escape routes. But here's where it gets really interesting. Peasants developed elaborate systems for sharing space and resources with other travelers. When you found a good shelter spot, you might encounter other peasants who had the same idea. This created opportunities for mutual protection and resource sharing, but also potential conflicts over limited space. Smart peasants learned to approach these situations diplomatically, offering to share food or take turns, keeping watch in exchange for shelter space. These temporary communities could form and dissolve within hours, but they often meant the difference between life and death. The bartering system that developed around shelter was absolutely ingenious. Peasants who couldn't pay with money learned to identify what various hosts needed and offer their services accordingly. A peasant with medical knowledge might treat sick animals in exchange for barn space. Someone skilled in crafts could repair tools or equipment for a night's shelter. Others became storytellers, entertaining hosts with news and tales from distant regions. This created a complex economy where skills and services were more valuable than coins. What's really impressive is how peasants learned to read social situations and adapt their approach accordingly. Approaching a wealthy household required different tactics than seeking shelter from fellow peasants. They had to quickly assess the local customs, political situation, and economic conditions to determine the best strategy for securing shelter. Some peasants became masters of first impressions, knowing exactly how to present themselves to maximize their chances of being welcomed. The seasonal survival strategies were incredibly sophisticated. During harvest time, peasants could offer their labor in exchange for sleeping in grain storage areas or workers' quarters. Winter required different tactics, seeking shelter near workshops where fires were kept burning, or finding stable space where animal body heat could provide warmth. Spring and summer opened up possibilities for outdoor shelter, but also brought challenges like insects, flooding, and increased competition for good spots. The psychological aspects of survival were just as important as the physical ones. Peasants had to maintain their dignity and social standing while essentially begging for shelter. They developed ways to frame their requests that emphasized mutual benefit rather than charity. A peasant might offer to help with evening chores, share news from the road, or provide an extra pair of hands for morning tasks. This allowed hosts to feel they were getting value for their hospitality rather than just supporting a beggar. What really gets me is how these survival strategies created informal networks of mutual support. Peasants who had received help would remember their benefactors and look for ways to return the favor. This created long-term relationships that could span decades, with traveling peasants building up networks of contacts across vast regions. Some became unofficial ambassadors between distant communities, carrying messages and maintaining connections that had economic and social value. The gender dynamics around survival strategies were particularly complex. Women traveling alone had to be even more creative and cautious about securing shelter. They often sought out female-headed households or religious communities where they might feel safer. Some women traveled in groups for mutual protection, pooling their resources and skills to secure better accommodations. Others specialized in skills that were particularly valued by potential hosts: textile work, food preparation, or childcare. The innovation in makeshift shelter construction was genuinely impressive. Peasants learned to create temporary shelters using whatever materials they could find or carry. A traveling cloak could become a lean-to shelter. Branches and leaves could create windbreaks, and even hay or straw could be arranged to provide insulation. Some peasants carried simple tools specifically for shelter construction: a small hatchet for cutting branches, rope for securing materials, or a piece of oiled cloth for waterproofing. The safety considerations were constant and complex. Peasants had to balance the need for shelter with the risk of discovery by bandits, wild animals, or hostile locals. They developed early warning systems, sleeping in shifts, and escape plans for various scenarios. Some carried weapons or tools that could serve as protection, while others relied on stealth and the ability to quickly disappear if threatened. What's really striking is how these survival experiences shaped peasant culture and values. People who had relied on the kindness of strangers often became more generous hosts themselves. The shared experience of vulnerability created bonds that transcended normal social boundaries. Peasants developed a code of mutual aid that helped sustain these informal networks across generations. The long-term impact of these survival strategies was enormous. Peasants who mastered the art of finding shelter could access opportunities far from their home villages. They could participate in seasonal labor markets, attend distant markets, or even relocate permanently to areas with better prospects. These skills enabled a kind of social mobility that would have been impossible without the ability to survive on the road. Now we're reaching the heart of what made medieval peasant travel possible: the complex web of hospitality, culture, and social bonds that literally kept people alive on the road. What absolutely blows my mind is how these supposedly brutal medieval times actually had sophisticated systems of mutual aid that functioned across class lines, religious boundaries, and even national borders. We're talking about unwritten rules and cultural expectations that created a safety net for travelers. Even when official institutions failed, this hospitality wasn't just about kindness. It was about recognizing that everyone might need help someday, and that maintaining these social bonds was essential for community survival. The foundation of medieval hospitality was actually deeply rooted in religious teaching, but it extended far beyond formal religious institutions. The Christian concept of welcoming strangers as potential angels created a cultural expectation that offering shelter was a moral obligation. But even non-religious households understood that hospitality was a form of social insurance. You help travelers today because you might need help tomorrow. This created a reciprocal system where generosity was both a virtue and a practical survival strategy. What's really fascinating is how these hospitality networks operated across different social classes. While wealthy households might offer formal guest accommodations, peasant families would share their one-room homes with travelers, often sleeping on the floor so guests could have the bed. The quality of hospitality varied by economic means, but the expectation of offering something existed at every level of society. Even the poorest peasant household might share their simple meal or offer space by the fire to a fellow traveler. The economic logic behind medieval hospitality was actually quite sophisticated. Hosting travelers brought news, trade opportunities, and connections to distant markets. A peasant who regularly hosted travelers might learn about crop prices in other regions, hear about job opportunities, or even find marriage partners for their children. This information exchange was valuable enough to justify the cost of providing food and shelter. Smart hosts understood that today's poor traveler might become tomorrow's wealthy merchant or influential connection. But the social bonds created by hospitality went way deeper than just economic exchange. When someone shared their home with you during a vulnerable time, it created lasting relationships that could span decades. Peasants would remember hosts who had helped them and look for opportunities to return the favor. This created informal networks of mutual obligation that stretched across hundreds of miles. Some peasants built up so many hospitality connections that they could travel vast distances relying entirely on these relationships. The rituals and customs around hospitality were incredibly detailed and varied by region. There were specific ways to approach a household, formal phrases to use when requesting shelter, and established customs for how guests should behave. Breaking these social codes could result in being turned away or even attacked. Successful travelers learned to adapt their approach based on local customs, religious practices, and social expectations. This required a kind of cultural intelligence that many peasants developed through experience. What really impresses me is how these hospitality systems created informal codes of conduct that governed traveler behavior. Guests were expected to contribute to household tasks, share news and stories, and leave the accommodation in good condition. Abusing hospitality, stealing, being disruptive, or overstaying welcome could result in being blacklisted from entire regions. These social consequences were often more effective than formal law enforcement at maintaining order. The seasonal patterns of hospitality were complex and strategic. During harvest time, households needed extra workers and were more willing to provide accommodation in exchange for labor. Winter hospitality was more scarce but more crucial, as exposure could be fatal. Religious holidays created special obligations for hospitality, with some households opening their doors specifically during certain festivals. Experienced travelers learned to time their journeys around these seasonal opportunities. The role of women in hospitality networks was particularly important and often overlooked. Women typically managed household hospitality decisions and were often more skilled at assessing the character and needs of potential guests. Female travelers often received different treatment and had access to different types of accommodation. Women's networks of hospitality sometimes operated independently of male-dominated formal institutions. This created alternative shelter options that were crucial for female travelers' safety. What's really striking is how these hospitality networks created cultural exchange that shaped medieval society. Travelers carried ideas, techniques, and innovations between communities, spreading knowledge faster than any formal communication system. New agricultural techniques, craft methods, and even political ideas traveled along these hospitality networks. The conversation around evening meals in peasant homes became a form of informal education and cultural transmission. The enforcement of hospitality obligations was both social and practical. Communities that gained reputations for being inhospitable found themselves isolated from trade networks and information flows. Individual households that consistently turned away travelers might find themselves unable to get help during emergencies. This created strong incentives for maintaining hospitality traditions even when resources were scarce. The long-term impact of these hospitality systems was enormous for medieval society. They enabled economic mobility, cultural exchange, and social connections that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Peasants who mastered the art of giving and receiving hospitality could access opportunities far beyond their local communities. These networks also provided crucial information about political changes, economic conditions, and social developments across vast regions. Looking back at this entire journey through medieval peasant travel and shelter, what strikes me most is how these seemingly desperate circumstances created incredibly sophisticated social systems, from the formal shelter networks of monasteries and inns to the informal survival strategies of sleeping rough and bartering for space. Medieval peasants developed solutions that enabled mobility and opportunity despite incredible obstacles. The hospitality culture that emerged wasn't just about charity. It was about recognizing our shared vulnerability and creating mutual support systems that benefited everyone. These medieval peasants, often dismissed as ignorant or helpless, actually created some of the most effective traveler support networks in human history. All right, everyone, we're shifting into our second story tonight. And honestly, this one is going to make you look at hoodies in a completely different way. We're diving into the medieval world of hood fashion and innovation, where what started as basic survival gear for peasants evolved into one of the most important fashion statements in European history. What absolutely fascinates me about this topic is how these simple pieces of cloth became symbols of social status, professional identity, and cultural rebellion all at the same time. We're talking about a fashion revolution that happened centuries before anyone even knew what fashion was supposed to be. The humble medieval hood started as pure necessity, protection from rain, wind, and cold that could literally save your life. Picture a medieval peasant working in the fields during a brutal winter storm, with nothing but a simple cloth hood to protect their head and neck from freezing temperatures. This wasn't fashion. This was survival technology that had to work in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. The basic hood was essentially a piece of fabric sewn into a cone shape that could be pulled over the head with enough extra material to cover the shoulders and provide some protection for the neck. But here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval people didn't just accept basic functionality. Even the poorest peasants started modifying their hoods almost immediately, adding features that made them more practical, more comfortable, or more distinctive. They'd add drawstrings to make them fit better, extra fabric for more coverage, or decorative elements that reflected their personality or regional identity. This wasn't vanity. It was the beginning of a cultural evolution where practical clothing became a form of personal expression. What's really impressive is how quickly hood innovation spread across different social classes. Nobles and wealthy merchants saw the practical advantages of peasant hood modifications and started incorporating them into their own clothing. But they also began competing to create more elaborate and expensive versions, using finer materials and more complex construction techniques. This created a fascinating dynamic where fashion innovations flowed both up and down the social ladder. The regional variations that developed were absolutely incredible. Different areas of Europe developed distinct hood styles based on local climate, available materials, and cultural preferences. Northern regions created hoods with extra insulation and wind protection, while Mediterranean areas developed lighter versions that provided sun protection without overheating. These regional differences became so pronounced that you could often tell where someone was from just by looking at their hood. The psychological impact of hood wearing was surprisingly complex. Hoods provided a sense of privacy and anonymity that was rare in medieval society. You could pull your hood up and create a personal space even in crowded marketplaces or during long journeys. This psychological benefit was so valued that hoods became associated with contemplation, prayer, and intellectual work. Many medieval scholars and religious figures specifically chose hooded garments because they facilitated concentration and meditation. But the social implications were equally important. Hoods became markers of profession, social status, and even political affiliation. Different occupations developed specific hood styles. Merchants wore hoods that projected prosperity. Craftsmen had practical hoods suited to their work, and religious figures adopted hoods that reflected their spiritual commitments. The way you wore your hood, the materials you used, and the modifications you made all sent specific social messages. What really gets me excited about this topic is how hood innovation drove broader developments in textile technology. The demand for better hood materials led to improvements in wool processing, fabric weaving, and waterproofing techniques. Craftsmen developed new methods for creating more durable and comfortable fabrics, specifically for hood construction. These innovations then spread to other types of clothing, driving overall improvements in medieval textile production. The economic impact was enormous too. Hood production became a significant industry, with specialized craftsmen developing expertise in hood design and construction. The competition to create better hoods drove innovation in materials, construction techniques, and decorative elements. Some regions became famous for their hood-making expertise, creating trade networks that stretched across Europe. A well-made hood could be a valuable trade good that commanded high prices in distant markets. The gender dynamics around hood wearing were particularly fascinating. Both men and women wore hoods, but they developed different styles and social meanings. Women's hoods often incorporated decorative elements that reflected their social status and family connections. Men's hoods were more likely to emphasize professional identity and practical functionality. These gender differences influenced hood design and created distinct market segments within the growing hood industry. What's really striking is how hoods became connected to identity and cultural expression. Young people used hood modifications to distinguish themselves from their parents' generation. Different social groups developed distinct hood styles that reflected their values and aspirations. Some hood styles became associated with rebellion or nonconformity, while others represented traditional values and social stability. The technological innovations that came out of hood development were genuinely impressive. Medieval craftsmen developed new cutting techniques, sewing methods, and fabric treatments, specifically for hood construction. They learned to create three-dimensional shapes from flat fabric to waterproof materials without making them stiff, and to add decorative elements without compromising functionality. These technical advances laid the foundation for more sophisticated clothing construction that would influence fashion for centuries. Looking at this evolution from basic protection to fashion statement, what strikes me most is how human creativity transforms even the most practical necessities into forms of cultural expression. The medieval hood wasn't just clothing. It was a canvas for innovation, status display, and personal identity. The peasants who first modified their simple hoods for better protection were unknowingly starting a fashion revolution that would eventually transform European culture. Now we're diving into the really ingenious part, how medieval peasants turned basic hood survival into an art form of practical innovation. And honestly, this is where their creativity under pressure really shines through. What absolutely blows my mind is how these supposedly simple medieval workers developed hood modifications that were centuries ahead of their time, creating features that modern outdoor gear companies would be jealous of. We're talking about people who had to work in brutal weather conditions, while wearing clothing that had to protect them, allow movement, and last for years without replacement. The innovations they developed weren't just clever. They were life-saving technologies disguised as clothing modifications. The basic challenge peasants faced was that their hoods had to serve multiple functions simultaneously. During harvest season, they needed sun protection that wouldn't overheat them during heavy physical labor. Winter work required wind and rain protection that wouldn't restrict their vision or hearing. Daily tasks like carrying loads, using tools, or tending animals all required specific hood adaptations. Smart peasants learned to modify their hoods based on seasonal needs, essentially creating modular clothing systems centuries before anyone understood the concept. The fabric modifications peasants developed were genuinely sophisticated. They learned to create different thicknesses in different parts of the hood, thicker material over the head for warmth, thinner sections around the face for better vision and breathing. Some peasants would add extra layers of fabric in high-wear areas, essentially creating reinforced zones that extended the hood's lifespan. Others developed techniques for making certain sections waterproof, while keeping other areas breathable. These weren't random modifications, they were engineered solutions to specific problems. What's really impressive is how peasants learned to work with different materials based on availability and need. When wool was scarce, they'd incorporate linen, hemp, or even leather into their hood construction. They discovered that combining materials could create better performance than using any single fabric. A hood might have a wool exterior for warmth, a linen lining for comfort, and leather reinforcements in stress areas. These composite constructions were incredibly advanced for their time and demonstrated real understanding of material properties. The attachment systems peasants developed were absolutely brilliant. Simple hoods that just sat on your head would blow off in strong wind or fall forward during physical work. Peasants invented drawstring systems, toggle closures, and even primitive snap attachments that could secure hoods while still allowing quick removal. Some developed hoods that attached to their main garments, creating integrated clothing systems that couldn't be lost or stolen. Others created detachable systems that allowed one hood to be used with multiple garments. The ventilation innovations were particularly clever. Working in a hood during strenuous labor could create dangerous overheating, but removing protection could expose you to injury or weather. Peasants learned to create ventilation holes in strategic locations, often covered with flaps that could be opened or closed as needed. Some developed hoods with adjustable openings around the face that could provide more airflow during work and close up for maximum protection during storms. These climate control features were incredibly sophisticated for handmade garments. What really gets me excited is how peasants adapted their hoods for specific occupations. Farmers needed hoods that wouldn't catch on grain stalks or interfere with scythe work. Shepherds required hoods that allowed them to hear approaching wolves, while protecting against mountain weather. Fishermen developed waterproof hoods that could handle saltwater spray without deteriorating. Each profession evolved distinct hood modifications that reflected their unique working conditions and safety requirements. The seasonal adaptation strategies were remarkably sophisticated. Some peasants created reversible hoods with different properties on each side, dark colors for winter heat absorption and light colors for summer heat reflection. Others developed modular systems where they could add or remove insulating layers based on weather conditions. The most innovative peasants created hoods with removable linings that could be washed separately or replaced when worn out. These adaptability features showed real understanding of how clothing needed to function across different seasons. The repair and maintenance innovations were equally impressive. Peasants couldn't afford to replace clothing frequently, so they developed techniques for extending hood lifespan indefinitely. They learned to patch holes in ways that actually strengthened the garment, to reinforce stress points before they failed, and to modify worn hoods for different uses. Some became so skilled at hood repair that their patched garments were more durable than the originals. This repair expertise became valuable knowledge that was passed down through generations. The tool integration features peasants developed were absolutely ingenious. Some hoods included small pockets or loops for carrying essential items like needles, small knives, or fire-starting materials. Others had reinforced areas where tools could be attached or where protective gear could be mounted. These weren't just clothing items. They were wearable tool systems that increased efficiency and reduced the risk of losing essential equipment. What's really striking is how these practical innovations influenced hood aesthetics. Functional features like reinforced seams, adjustable closures, and ventilation panels created distinctive visual patterns that became style elements. Peasants started emphasizing these practical features as decorative elements, essentially turning engineering solutions into fashion statements. This demonstrated how form and function could enhance each other rather than competing. The knowledge transfer systems that developed around hood innovation were fascinating. Experienced peasants would teach younger workers not just how to make hoods, but how to analyze working conditions and develop appropriate modifications. This wasn't just craft instruction. It was engineering education that helped people solve problems creatively. The skills peasants learned from hood modification often transferred to other areas, making them better problem solvers in general. The success of these peasant innovations was so impressive that they eventually influenced formal clothing production. Professional tailors and clothing makers began incorporating peasant modifications into their designs. Features that had been developed through trial and error in fields and workshops became standard elements in commercial clothing. This upward flow of innovation showed how practical necessity could drive developments that benefited all levels of society. Now we're getting to the really fascinating transformation, how the humble peasant hood evolved into the chaperone and became one of the most important status symbols in medieval fashion. What absolutely blows my mind is how this transition happened, with practical working-class innovations suddenly becoming the height of aristocratic style. We're talking about a complete social revolution disguised as a fashion trend, where clothing that had been designed for survival became a way to display wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. The chaperone wasn't just a fancy hood. It was a statement piece that could communicate your social position from across a crowded marketplace. The evolution from basic hood to chaperone was gradual but dramatic. What started as practical modifications by working peasants began attracting attention from merchants, craftsmen, and eventually nobility. The key innovation was the addition of a long tail or liripipe, essentially an extended piece of fabric that hung down from the hood. This tail served no practical purpose for most wearers, but it became the defining characteristic of fashionable headwear. The longer and more elaborate your liripipe, the higher your social status appeared to be. What's really impressive is how the chaperone became a canvas for displaying wealth and craftsmanship. Wealthy individuals would have their chaperones made from expensive materials like silk, velvet, or fine wool, often in colors that were expensive to produce. The construction became incredibly elaborate, with complex pleating, decorative stitching, and sometimes even jeweled embellishments. Some chaperones were so ornate and expensive that they represented months of a craftsman's wages. This transformed a piece of working-class survival gear into one of the most expensive fashion items of the medieval period. The social signaling aspect of chaperone wearing was incredibly sophisticated. Different styles, colors, and wearing methods communicated specific messages about the wearer's profession, social status, and cultural affiliations. Merchants wore chaperones that projected prosperity and reliability, while nobles chose styles that emphasized their aristocratic heritage. The way you arranged your chaperone, how you positioned the tail, how you wore the hood portion, even how you held your head, all sent specific social messages. Master chaperone wearers could communicate complex social information without saying a word. But here's where it gets really interesting. The chaperone became a symbol of cultural rebellion and generational change. Younger people adopted increasingly elaborate and unconventional chaperone styles to distinguish themselves from their parents' generation. Some wore their chaperones in ways that older people considered inappropriate or even scandalous. This created ongoing fashion conflicts, where clothing choices became statements about social values and cultural identity. The chaperone wars of the 14th and 15th centuries were essentially battles over who got to define proper social behavior. The professional implications of chaperone wearing were enormous. Different occupations developed distinct chaperone styles that became almost like uniforms. Lawyers, doctors, merchants, and craftsmen all had specific chaperone conventions that reflected their professional identity. Wearing the wrong style of chaperone could damage your professional reputation or even prevent you from doing business. Some cities actually passed laws regulating chaperone styles based on profession and social class. What really gets me excited is how the chaperone influenced broader fashion trends. The success of elaborate headwear encouraged innovation in other clothing items. Clothing makers began adding decorative elements, experimenting with new materials, and creating more complex construction techniques. The chaperone essentially launched the medieval fashion industry, creating demand for specialized craftsmen and luxury materials. This had enormous economic implications, driving trade in expensive fabrics, and supporting skilled artisans across Europe. The gender dynamics around chaperone wearing were particularly complex. While both men and women wore chaperones, they developed different styles and social meanings. Women's chaperones often incorporated elements that reflected their family connections and marital status. Men's chaperones were more likely to emphasize professional identity and economic success. These gender differences created distinct market segments and influenced how chaperone styles evolved. The international spread of chaperone fashion was absolutely remarkable. What started as a local innovation in specific regions of Europe quickly spread across the continent and beyond. Different countries developed their own chaperone variations, incorporating local materials and cultural preferences. Trade networks carried chaperone styles between distant regions, creating a kind of early international fashion system. Some chaperone styles became so popular that they influenced clothing traditions in countries that had never seen the original peasant hoods. The technological innovations driven by chaperone production were genuinely impressive. Craftsmen developed new cutting techniques, sewing methods, and fabric treatment specifically for chaperone construction. They learned to create complex three-dimensional shapes, to work with expensive materials without waste, and to add decorative elements that enhanced rather than compromised the garment's functionality. These technical advances influenced clothing production methods that are still used today. What's really striking is how the chaperone became connected to political and religious identity. Different political factions adopted distinct chaperone styles as symbols of their allegiances. Religious groups used chaperone variations to express their spiritual commitments. Some chaperone styles became associated with specific political movements or religious reforms. This turned fashion choices into political statements that could have serious consequences. The economic impact of chaperone production was enormous. Entire industries developed around chaperone construction, from fabric production to specialized tailoring. Some regions became famous for their chaperone-making expertise, creating trade networks that stretched across Europe. The demand for luxury chaperones drove innovations in textile production and supported skilled craftsmen who might otherwise have had limited employment opportunities. The decline of chaperone fashion was as dramatic as its rise. By the late 15th century, changing social attitudes and new fashion trends made elaborate chaperones seem outdated and impractical. The same social forces that had driven chaperone innovation, the desire for status display and cultural expression, eventually moved on to other clothing items. But the influence of chaperone fashion continued, establishing patterns of luxury consumption and status signaling that shaped European fashion for centuries. Looking at this transformation from practical hood to status symbol, what strikes me most is how human creativity can transform even the most utilitarian objects into forms of cultural expression. The chaperone wasn't just clothing, it was a communication system, an art form, and an economic force that influenced medieval society in ways that went far beyond fashion. The peasants who first modified their hoods for better protection were unknowingly creating the foundation for one of the most important fashion revolutions in European history. Now we're wrapping up our hood story with the most incredible part, how these medieval innovations continue to influence fashion and design today. And honestly, this connection between past and present is absolutely mind-blowing. What fascinates me most is how the creative problem-solving that started with medieval peasants trying to stay warm has evolved into modern fashion statements that millions of people wear every day. We're talking about a design legacy that spans nearly 1,000 years, connecting medieval survival gear to contemporary streetwear in ways that most people never realize. The hoodie you're probably wearing right now is basically a direct descendant of those innovative medieval hoods we've been exploring. The technological DNA of medieval hood innovation is absolutely everywhere in modern clothing design. Those adjustable drawstrings that peasants developed for securing their hoods against wind are now standard features in everything from hoodies to rain jackets. The ventilation systems that medieval workers created for temperature control evolved into the complex airflow management systems used in modern athletic wear. Even the modular approaches that peasants used, adding or removing layers based on conditions, became the foundation for modern layering systems used by outdoor enthusiasts and athletes. What's really striking is how the social signaling aspects of medieval chaperones predicted modern fashion psychology. The way medieval people used hood styles to communicate their identity, profession, and cultural affiliations is exactly what we do with contemporary fashion choices. A modern hoodie can signal everything from your favorite sports team to your musical tastes to your attitude toward authority. The same human need for self-expression through clothing that drove chaperone innovation continues to drive fashion trends today. The modern hoodie industry is essentially a direct evolution of medieval hood-making traditions. Contemporary designers use the same basic principles that medieval craftsmen developed, creating functional head coverings that provide comfort, protection, and style. The construction techniques, material choices, and even the social meanings have clear connections to medieval precedents. When you see a high-end fashion designer creating a luxury hoodie, they're participating in a tradition that started with medieval peasants trying to survive harsh weather. But the influence extends far beyond just hoodies. The medieval understanding of how clothing could be both functional and expressive influenced the entire development of Western fashion. The idea that working-class innovations could become high-fashion statements, which we saw with the chaperone, established patterns that continue today. Modern fashion regularly takes inspiration from military gear, work clothes, and street culture, following the same upward flow of innovation that characterized medieval hood development. The material innovations that came out of medieval hood making had lasting impacts on textile technology. Medieval craftsmen's experiments with waterproofing, insulation, and durability led to techniques that influenced fabric production for centuries. Some of the composite construction methods that peasants developed for their hoods, combining different materials for optimal performance, became standard practices in textile manufacturing. Modern performance fabrics often use principles that medieval hood makers discovered through trial and error. What really gets me excited is how medieval hood culture predicted modern fashion democratization. The way peasant innovations eventually influenced aristocratic fashion parallels how street style and subculture fashion now influences high-end designers. Social media has accelerated this process, but the fundamental dynamic, creative individuals developing new styles that eventually enter mainstream fashion remains unchanged. Medieval hood innovation was essentially an early version of what we now call grassroots fashion movement. The global spread of hoodie culture mirrors the medieval spread of chaperone fashion. Just as different regions developed their own chaperone variations while maintaining core design principles, modern hoodie culture has evolved differently in different countries while sharing common elements. Japanese hoodie design emphasizes different features than American or European styles, but they all trace back to the same medieval innovations. This shows how successful design concepts can adapt to different cultures while maintaining their essential identity. The economic lessons from medieval hood innovation are particularly relevant today. The way chaperone production created entire industries and supported skilled craftsmen parallels how modern fashion brands build economic ecosystems around popular clothing items. The luxury hoodie market, with some pieces selling for hundreds or thousands of dollars, directly follows the medieval pattern of taking practical working-class clothing and transforming it into luxury goods. The sustainability aspects of medieval hood making offer important lessons for contemporary fashion. Medieval people's emphasis on repair, modification, and long-term durability contrasts sharply with modern fast fashion's disposable approach. The way medieval craftsmen designed hoods to last for years and be continuously modified for different needs offers a model for more sustainable clothing production. Some modern designers are explicitly returning to medieval principles of durability and adaptability. What's really fascinating is how medieval hood innovation demonstrated the power of user-driven design. The most successful innovations came from people who actually wore and used the clothing, not from designers working in isolation. This principle has become central to modern product development, with companies increasingly involving users in the design process. The medieval tradition of continuous modification and improvement by end users is now recognized as crucial for creating truly functional products. The cultural impact of medieval hood innovation extends into contemporary discussions about identity and self-expression. The way medieval people used clothing to communicate complex social information laid the groundwork for modern fashion as a form of personal and cultural expression. Contemporary debates about dress codes, cultural appropriation, and fashion as political statement all have roots in medieval precedents. The design principles that emerged from medieval hood innovation continue to influence contemporary fashion education. Fashion schools now teach many of the same principles that medieval craftsmen developed intuitively: the importance of understanding user needs, the value of iterative design improvement, and the connection between form and function. Modern designers studying medieval clothing often discover techniques and approaches that are more sophisticated than contemporary methods. Looking at this incredible journey from medieval survival gear to modern fashion staple, what strikes me most is how human creativity and innovation create lasting legacies that transcend time and culture. The medieval peasants who first modified their hoods for better protection were solving immediate practical problems, but they were also laying the foundation for fashion traditions that continue to evolve today. Every time you put on a hoodie, adjust a drawstring, or appreciate the way a hood protects you from weather. You're participating in a tradition of innovation that started nearly 1,000 years ago. The next time you see someone wearing a hoodie, remember that they're carrying on a legacy of creative problem solving that connects us directly to medieval craftsmen who turned survival into art. Hey everyone, we're diving into our third story tonight. And honestly, this one is going to completely shatter your assumptions about medieval peasant life. I'm talking about the food that peasants actually ate. And spoiler alert, it wasn't the endless gruel and moldy bread that Hollywood wants you to believe. What absolutely fascinates me about this topic is how archaeological evidence and historical records paint a completely different picture of peasant cuisine than the popular starving medieval masses narrative. We're looking at people who often had access to more varied, fresh, and nutritious food than many modern processed food consumers, which is honestly mind-blowing when you think about it. The biggest myth we need to destroy right away is this idea that medieval peasants were constantly on the verge of starvation, surviving on nothing but terrible bread and water. This stereotype comes from a combination of Victorian-era historians who wanted to make their own time period look better, and modern misconceptions about what poor meant in a medieval context. The reality is that medieval peasants had access to an incredible variety of foods that were often fresher, more seasonal, and more nutritious than what many people eat today. They weren't eating like kings, but they definitely weren't eating like prisoners either. The foundation of peasant diet was actually quite sophisticated and varied significantly by region and season. Bread was important, but it was just one component of a diverse diet that included vegetables, dairy products, meat, fish, and wild foods. Medieval peasants were skilled foragers who knew dozens of edible plants, mushrooms, and herbs that could supplement their cultivated crops. They raised chickens, pigs, and sometimes cattle, providing eggs, milk, cheese, and meat throughout the year. Rivers and ponds provided fish, while forests offered game, nuts, and seasonal fruits. What's really impressive is how peasants managed food security through crop diversity. They didn't rely on single crops like modern industrial agriculture. They grew multiple grains, vegetables, and legumes that matured at different times. This meant that even if one crop failed, others would provide sustenance. They grew rye, barley, oats, and wheat for different purposes, plus beans, peas, cabbage, onions, leeks, and dozens of other vegetables. This diversity was actually more resilient than many modern farming systems. The seasonal rhythm of peasant eating was incredibly rich and complex. Spring brought fresh greens, herbs, and early vegetables after the preserved foods of winter. Summer provided an abundance of fresh fruits, vegetables, and dairy products when animals were producing maximum milk. Fall was harvest time, with fresh grains, late fruits, and the preparation of preserved foods for winter. Even winter wasn't just about survival. It was when preserved meats, fermented vegetables, and stored grains provided variety and nutrition. The brewing and fermentation knowledge that peasants possessed was absolutely remarkable. Every household knew how to make ale, which was actually safer to drink than water in many areas. They fermented cabbage into sauerkraut, made cheese from milk, and preserved meat through various fermentation processes. These fermented foods were incredibly nutritious and provided probiotics that supported digestive health. Modern nutritionists are just rediscovering the health benefits of fermented foods that medieval peasants took for granted. What really gets me excited is how peasants approached wild food harvesting. They had encyclopedic knowledge of edible plants, mushrooms, nuts, and berries that could be gathered from forests, fields, and wastelands. This wasn't just emergency food. It was a regular part of their diet that provided variety, nutrition, and medicinal benefits. They knew which plants were safe, when to harvest them, and how to prepare them for maximum nutrition. This knowledge was passed down through generations and represented a sophisticated understanding of local ecosystems. The animal husbandry practices that provided protein were much more diverse than most people realize. Peasants raised chickens for eggs and meat, pigs for bacon and lard, and sometimes cattle for milk and eventual meat. They also kept geese, ducks, and rabbits, providing different types of protein throughout the year. Fish farming in ponds was common, and many peasants had rights to fish in local streams and rivers. This meant that protein deficiency was actually quite rare among medieval peasants. The cooking techniques peasants used were surprisingly sophisticated. They knew how to roast, boil, stew, ferment, smoke, and preserve foods using methods that maximized both flavor and nutrition. Their one-pot meals were complex combinations of grains, vegetables, meat, and herbs that provided complete nutrition. They used herbs and spices not just for flavor, but for their medicinal properties. Many peasant dishes were actually more nutritionally balanced than modern processed foods. The social aspects of peasant eating were equally important. Meals were communal events that strengthened family and community bonds. Food sharing was common, with neighbors helping each other during difficult times. Feast days and celebrations featured special foods that brought communities together. This social dimension of eating provided psychological benefits that supported overall health and well-being. The regional variations in peasant cuisine were absolutely incredible. Mediterranean peasants had access to olive oil, wine, and different vegetables than their northern counterparts. Coastal peasants included more fish and sea vegetables in their diet. Mountain peasants specialized in dairy products and preserved meats. Each region developed distinct food cultures that reflected local resources and climate conditions. What's really striking is how peasant food knowledge represented a sophisticated understanding of nutrition. They knew which food combinations provided complete proteins, which plants prevented scurvy, and which fermented foods supported digestive health. This knowledge was empirical rather than scientific, but it was often more accurate than formal nutrition advice well into the modern era. Many traditional peasant food practices are now recognized as optimal for human health. Now we're diving into how geography and climate shaped peasant cuisine in absolutely fascinating ways. And honestly, this is where you really see how smart and adaptable medieval people were. What blows my mind is how peasants in different regions developed completely distinct food cultures based on what their local environment could provide, creating regional cuisines that were incredibly sophisticated and perfectly adapted to local conditions. We're talking about people who became master ecologists, out of necessity, learning to work with seasonal patterns and local resources in ways that modern industrial agriculture has largely forgotten. The relationship between environment and medieval diet was so intimate that you could literally taste the landscape in every meal. The seasonal eating patterns that peasants developed were absolutely brilliant and way more complex than most people realize. Spring was what they called the hungry time, not because there was no food, but because preserved winter supplies were running low and fresh crops hadn't matured yet. But peasants turned this challenge into opportunity, becoming expert foragers who knew exactly which wild plants emerged first. They'd gather young nettle shoots, dandelion greens, wild garlic, and dozens of other plants that provided fresh vitamins after months of stored foods. This wasn't just survival. It was a sophisticated understanding of how to bridge the gap between seasons. Summer eating was when peasant cuisine really showed its diversity and abundance. The variety of fresh foods available was incredible. Multiple types of grains, vegetables, fruits, herbs, and fresh dairy products from animals that were at peak production. Peasants would eat fresh vegetables like peas, beans, cabbage, leeks, and onions, plus fruits like apples, pears, and berries. They'd make fresh cheese, butter, and other dairy products when milk production was highest. Summer meals were often more varied and nutritious than what many modern people eat year-round. Fall was the master season for peasant food culture, when the entire community mobilized for harvest and preservation. This wasn't just about gathering crops, it was about processing, preserving, and storing food in ways that would maintain nutrition and flavor throughout the winter. They'd smoke meats, ferment vegetables, brew ale, make cheese, and dry fruits using techniques that modern food scientists now recognize as optimal for preserving nutrients. The Fall Harvest Festival wasn't just celebration. It was the culmination of a year's worth of sophisticated food production and preservation. Winter eating was far more varied and nutritious than the popular stereotype suggests. Peasants had access to preserved meats, fermented vegetables, stored grains, nuts, dried fruits, and dairy products that provided complete nutrition throughout the cold months. They'd make hearty stews combining preserved meats with stored vegetables and grains, creating meals that were both filling and nutritionally complete. The fermented foods they consumed during winter provided probiotics and vitamins that supported immune function during the challenging cold season. The regional variations in peasant cuisine were absolutely incredible and reflected deep understanding of local ecosystems. Mediterranean peasants had access to olive oil, wine grapes, citrus fruits, and vegetables that couldn't grow in northern climates. Their diet included more fish, fresh vegetables, and foods that we now recognize as part of the healthy Mediterranean diet. They developed preservation techniques using salt, oil, and sun drying that were perfectly adapted to their warm, dry climate. Northern European peasants developed completely different food cultures based on their colder, wetter climates. They specialized in dairy products, fermented foods, and preservation techniques that worked in cold conditions. Their diet included more grains, root vegetables, and preserved meats that could provide energy and warmth during long winters. They became experts at brewing ale and fermenting vegetables, creating foods that were both nutritious and safe to consume during months when fresh foods were scarce. Coastal peasants had access to incredible variety through fishing and sea foraging. They knew dozens of edible seaweeds, shellfish, and fish that provided protein and minerals not available to inland populations. They developed sophisticated preservation techniques for seafood, including smoking, salting, and drying methods that could preserve fish for months. Their diet was often higher in essential fatty acids and minerals than inland peasants, showing how geography directly influenced nutrition. Mountain peasants developed food cultures centered around dairy products and preserved meats. The short growing seasons and challenging terrain meant they specialized in animal husbandry and became masters of cheese making and meat preservation. They developed hundreds of different cheese varieties, each adapted to local conditions and seasonal availability. Their preserved meat techniques were so sophisticated that many are still used in modern artisanal food production. The adaptation to local water sources was particularly clever. In areas with questionable water quality, peasants became expert brewers, creating low-alcohol beverages that were safe to drink and provided additional nutrition. They'd brew ale from various grains, make fruit wines, and create herbal drinks that had both nutritional and medicinal benefits. This wasn't just about avoiding contaminated water. It was about turning a potential problem into a source of calories and nutrients. What's really impressive is how peasants adapted their food preparation techniques to local climate conditions. In humid climates, they developed preservation methods that prevented spoilage without refrigeration. In dry climates, they used sun-drying and salt-curing techniques that wouldn't work in wetter areas. In cold climates, they developed fermentation and smoking techniques that worked in low temperatures. Each region's food culture was perfectly adapted to local environmental conditions. The trade networks that developed around regional food specialties were fascinating. Peasants in areas with abundant salt would trade with those who had access to spices or special foods. Mountain cheesemakers would exchange their products for coastal fish or Mediterranean olive oil. These food trade networks created cultural exchange that enriched regional cuisines and provided access to foods that couldn't be produced locally. The seasonal celebration foods that developed in different regions showed how deeply connected peasant culture was to local food cycles. Spring celebrations featured fresh greens and young animals. Summer festivals highlighted fresh fruits and vegetables. Fall harvest celebrations showcased the year's bounty. And winter feasts featured preserved foods and special preparations. These celebrations weren't just social events, they were expressions of the deep relationship between human culture and natural food cycles. What really strikes me is how this intimate relationship between geography and diet created food cultures that were incredibly sustainable and nutritionally sound. Peasants ate foods that were adapted to their local environment, in season, and produced using methods that maintained soil health and biodiversity. Their food systems were resilient, diverse, and environmentally appropriate in ways that modern industrial agriculture struggles to achieve. The seasonal and regional eating patterns they developed offer important lessons for contemporary discussions about sustainable food systems. Now we're wrapping up our peasant food story with what I think is the most beautiful aspect, How eating together created the social bonds that literally kept medieval communities alive. What absolutely fascinates me about this topic is how food wasn't just about nutrition for medieval peasants. It was the foundation of social relationships, community identity, and survival networks that made life possible in a harsh world. We're talking about people who understood that sharing meals was as important as the food itself, creating social systems around eating that strengthened families and communities in ways that modern individualistic eating has largely lost. The medieval peasant table wasn't just where people ate. It was where communities were built and maintained. The communal eating practices that peasants developed were incredibly sophisticated forms of social organization. Meals were carefully orchestrated events where everyone had specific roles and responsibilities. The eldest family member would usually preside over the meal, serving food and ensuring everyone got their fair share. Children learned social hierarchy, proper behavior, and community values through these daily meal rituals. Even the poorest peasant families would gather for shared meals that reinforced family bonds and passed down cultural knowledge. But the really brilliant part was how peasants used food sharing as a form of social insurance. When one family had a poor harvest or faced unexpected hardship, neighbors would share their food supplies. This wasn't charity, it was a reciprocal system where everyone understood they might need help someday. A family that shared generously when times were good could expect help when they faced difficulties. This created incredibly strong community bonds that provided security in ways that no individual family could achieve alone. The seasonal community feasts were absolutely amazing examples of how food created social cohesion. Harvest festivals brought entire villages together to celebrate the year's bounty and share in the fruits of everyone's labor. These weren't just parties, they were essential community events that reinforced social bonds and shared identity. Everyone contributed something to the feast, whether it was food, labor, or entertainment. The shared preparation, eating, and cleanup created opportunities for social interaction that strengthened relationships across age groups and social levels. What's really impressive is how peasants used food sharing to resolve conflicts and maintain social harmony. When disputes arose between families or individuals, sharing a meal was often part of the reconciliation process. The act of eating together created a sense of shared humanity that made it easier to forgive grievances. Some communities had formal traditions where conflicts had to be resolved before major feast days, ensuring that social harmony was maintained. Food sharing became a tool for peacemaking that helped communities function despite inevitable interpersonal tensions. The preservation techniques peasants developed were inherently communal activities that brought people together. Brewing ale, making cheese, preserving meat, and fermenting vegetables were often done as group activities where neighbors helped each other. These work sessions combined practical food production with social interaction, creating opportunities for sharing knowledge, gossip, and mutual support. The skills required for food preservation were passed down through these communal work sessions, ensuring that essential knowledge was maintained and improved across generations. The religious and spiritual aspects of peasant eating were deeply integrated with community life. Blessing food before meals was standard practice that connected eating to spiritual beliefs. Religious feast days featured special foods that were prepared communally and shared with the entire community. Fasting periods were observed collectively, creating shared experiences that reinforced religious identity and community bonds. Food offerings to churches and religious festivals were community efforts that demonstrated collective devotion and support. What really gets me excited is how peasants used food sharing to integrate newcomers into their communities. When new families moved into a village, established residents would invite them to share meals as a way of welcoming them and assessing their character. These shared meals provided opportunities for newcomers to demonstrate their values and skills while learning about local customs and social expectations. The process of food sharing became a form of social vetting that helped communities maintain cohesion while remaining open to new members. The gender dynamics around food sharing were particularly complex and important. Women typically managed household food preparation and distribution, giving them significant social power and influence. They formed networks with other women around food-related activities like brewing, baking, and preserving. These networks provided mutual support, shared knowledge, and social connections that were crucial for family survival. Men participated in food sharing through activities like hunting, fishing, and livestock management, but women's food networks were often more extensive and influential. The economic aspects of food sharing created informal but powerful economic systems. Peasants would share surplus food with neighbors, not just out of generosity, but as a form of investment in future reciprocal help. These food exchanges created complex webs of obligation and mutual support that functioned like informal banks. A family that consistently shared food when they had surplus could expect help during difficult times. This system was often more reliable than formal economic institutions. The knowledge transfer that happened around shared meals was absolutely crucial for community survival. Older peasants would share their knowledge of weather patterns, crop management, and food preservation during communal meals. Young people learned essential survival skills through these informal educational sessions. New techniques and innovations were spread through food-sharing networks, ensuring that useful knowledge was quickly adopted across the community. The peasant table became a classroom where practical knowledge was passed down and improved. The crisis response systems that peasants developed around food sharing were incredibly effective. When disasters struck, crop failures, illness, or economic hardship, communities would mobilize their food-sharing networks to provide support. These responses were fast, efficient, and targeted to specific needs. Communities that maintained strong food-sharing traditions were more resilient and better able to survive challenges than those that relied on individual family resources. What's really striking is how these food-sharing practices created social cohesion that transcended class boundaries. Even when economic differences existed within peasant communities, shared meals created opportunities for social interaction and mutual understanding. Wealthier peasants were expected to share more generously, but they also received social status and influence in return. These systems created social stability that helped prevent the kind of class conflicts that could tear communities apart. Looking at this entire journey through medieval peasant food culture, what strikes me most is how eating was never just about individual nutrition. It was about creating and maintaining the social bonds that made survival possible. From the incredible variety of foods available to the sophisticated understanding of seasonal eating patterns, to the complex social systems built around food sharing, medieval peasants created food cultures that were both nutritionally sound and socially sustainable. They understood that food was about more than just feeding bodies. It was about feeding communities, relationships, and the social bonds that made life worth living. The next time you share a meal with friends or family, remember that you're participating in a tradition that goes back centuries and connects you to generations of people who understood that eating together is one of the most fundamental human activities. All right, everyone, we're diving into our final story tonight. And honestly, this one is going to completely flip your assumptions about medieval nutrition and health. I'm talking about the surprising reality that many medieval peasants actually ate healthier diets than modern people, which sounds absolutely insane until you look at the evidence. What absolutely fascinates me about this topic is how our modern understanding of nutrition science reveals that peasant food practices were often nutritionally superior to what wealthy nobles were eating, and sometimes even better than contemporary processed food diets. We're about to explore one of the most counterintuitive findings in medieval history, that being poor sometimes meant eating better. The peasant paradox is genuinely mind-blowing when you break it down nutritionally. While wealthy nobles were gorging themselves on refined white bread, massive amounts of meat, and expensive imported foods, peasants were eating what we now recognize as incredibly healthy diets. Their daily meals included whole grains, fresh vegetables, fermented foods, and moderate amounts of high-quality protein. They consumed more fiber, more diverse nutrients, and fewer processed foods than many modern people. The irony is that what they ate out of necessity was often optimal for human health. The whole grain consumption that was standard for peasants provided nutrition that modern processed foods can't match. Peasant bread was made from whole grains like rye, barley, and oats that retained all their nutrients and fiber. These grains provided complex carbohydrates, B vitamins, minerals, and fiber that supported digestive health and stable blood sugar. Meanwhile, wealthy people were eating white bread made from refined flour that had been stripped of most nutrients. The fancy food was actually nutritionally inferior to the peasant food. The vegetable consumption patterns of peasants were absolutely remarkable. They ate dozens of different vegetables throughout the year, many of which were wild plants that provided nutrients not found in cultivated crops. Their diet included leafy greens, root vegetables, legumes, and herbs that provided vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients that modern nutrition science recognizes as essential for health. They consumed more variety in a single season than many modern people eat in a year. The fermented food consumption was where peasants really showed their nutritional wisdom. Every peasant household regularly consumed fermented vegetables, dairy products, and beverages that provided probiotics essential for gut health. They ate sauerkraut, fermented dairy, and drank ale, all of which supported digestive health and immune function. Modern research has shown that these fermented foods provide benefits that no modern supplement can fully replicate. Peasants were getting optimal gut health support without even knowing why it worked. The protein quality in peasant diets was actually superior to what many wealthy people consumed. While nobles often ate large quantities of meat from grain-fed animals, peasants consumed smaller amounts of protein from animals that had been raised on diverse, natural diets. Their chickens, pigs, and cattle ate varied diets that produced meat, eggs, and dairy with better nutrient profiles. They also consumed fish, wild game, and plant proteins that provided complete amino acid profiles. The fat consumption patterns were surprisingly healthy. Peasants got their fats from nuts, seeds, fish, and animals that had been raised on natural diets. These fats provided omega-3 fatty acids and other essential nutrients that supported brain and heart health. They consumed less saturated fat than wealthy people who ate large amounts of meat but got more beneficial fats from diverse sources. Their fat intake was more balanced and nutritionally optimal. The seasonal eating patterns provided optimal nutrition timing. Peasants ate fresh, vitamin-rich foods during summer when their bodies needed energy for physical labor. They consumed more preserved, calorie-dense foods during winter when they needed energy for warmth and immune function. This seasonal variation provided nutrients when they were most needed and helped maintain healthy metabolic rhythms. Modern research shows that this seasonal eating pattern is optimal for human health. What's really striking is how peasant portion sizes were naturally appropriate for their activity levels. They ate enough to fuel their physically demanding lifestyles without overconsumption. Their meals were balanced combinations of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats that provided sustained energy. They didn't have access to the calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods that cause modern obesity and metabolic disorders. The hydration patterns were actually quite healthy. While peasants drank ale regularly, it was low-alcohol beer that provided calories and nutrients while being safer than water. They also consumed herbal teas, milk, and other beverages that provided hydration plus nutritional benefits. Their fluid intake was more varied and nutritionally valuable than modern soft drinks and processed beverages. The physical activity integration with eating was optimal. Peasants ate to fuel their physical work, creating a natural balance between calorie consumption and energy expenditure. They worked outdoors, getting vitamin D from sun exposure that helped with calcium absorption. Their lifestyle created conditions where food was efficiently used for energy and health rather than stored as excess fat. The stress eating patterns were actually healthier than modern habits. While peasants faced many stresses, they didn't have access to processed comfort foods that provide empty calories. Their stress responses were more likely to involve physical activity and social support rather than food consumption. When they did eat for comfort, it was usually nutritious foods shared with family or community. The longevity and health outcomes that resulted from peasant diets were often better than expected. While peasants faced other health challenges, their diet-related health was often superior to wealthy people. They had lower rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Their bones were stronger, their digestive health was better, and their immune systems were more robust. The foods they ate out of necessity provided health benefits that wealth couldn't buy. Now we're getting to the darker side of medieval food, the very real dangers that made eating a potentially deadly gamble. And honestly, this is where the health advantages of peasant diets met some absolutely terrifying realities. What strikes me most about this topic is how medieval people had to navigate constant food safety risks that could kill them, yet somehow developed eating practices that were often healthier than modern diets. We're talking about a time when contaminated food could wipe out entire communities, when certain foods were literally poisonous, and when the difference between a nutritious meal and a fatal one often came down to luck and hard-won experience. The medieval kitchen was both a source of remarkable nutrition and a potential death trap. The bacterial contamination risks were absolutely terrifying and constant. Without refrigeration, proper sanitation, or understanding of bacterial growth, medieval people were constantly risking food poisoning that could be fatal. Meat that sat too long in warm weather could develop deadly bacteria. Dairy products could harbor dangerous pathogens, and even vegetables could become contaminated through poor storage. The symptoms of severe food poisoning, violent vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration could kill healthy adults within days. Peasants had to develop almost supernatural instincts for detecting spoiled food through smell, appearance, and texture. The grain contamination problems were particularly devastating because bread was such a staple food. Ergot poisoning from contaminated rye could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Entire communities would experience mass poisoning events that were terrifying and often fatal. The symptoms included burning sensations, gangrene, and psychological effects that people interpreted as demonic possession. Peasants learned to carefully inspect grain and reject anything that looked suspicious, but contamination wasn't always visible. The water safety issues created a catch-22 situation, where the solution to one problem created another. Contaminated water could cause dysentery, cholera, and other deadly diseases. This drove people to consume ale and other fermented beverages as safer alternatives. But alcohol consumption, even at low levels, created its own health risks and social problems. Peasants had to balance the risk of waterborne disease against the risks of chronic alcohol consumption. The preservation method dangers were often worse than the original food safety problems. Salt curing could create toxic levels of sodium that caused kidney damage and high blood pressure. Smoking foods with certain woods could introduce carcinogenic compounds. Fermentation processes could go wrong, creating toxic substances instead of beneficial probiotics. The techniques that made food safer in one way often made it dangerous in another. What's really horrifying is how certain foods that seemed safe could be deadly under specific conditions. Mushrooms were a valuable food source, but misidentification could cause agonizing death. Some wild plants were nutritious when harvested at the right time, but toxic if gathered too early or too late. Even common foods like potatoes, when they were eventually introduced, could be poisonous if they turned green. The knowledge required to eat safely was enormous, and mistakes were often fatal. The seasonal disease patterns that affected food safety were particularly brutal. Summer heat created ideal conditions for bacterial growth and food spoilage. Winter storage problems led to mold growth and contamination. Spring brought the risk of eating plants that looked safe but weren't fully mature. Each season brought its own set of food safety challenges that required different strategies and knowledge. The social class differences in food safety risks were stark and often counterintuitive. Wealthy people had access to exotic foods that were often more dangerous than simple peasant fare. Imported spices could be adulterated with toxic substances. Elaborate prepared foods had more opportunities for contamination. The complex supply chains that brought luxury foods to wealthy tables created multiple points where contamination could occur. The pregnancy and childhood food safety issues were particularly heartbreaking. Pregnant women faced additional risks from contaminated foods that could cause miscarriage or birth defects. Children were more vulnerable to food poisoning and had higher mortality rates from foodborne illness. Infant feeding was especially dangerous, with contaminated milk or early weaning foods causing high death rates. The most vulnerable members of society faced the greatest food safety risks. The communal eating dangers could turn social gatherings into mass poisoning events. When contaminated food was shared among large groups, entire communities could be affected simultaneously. Wedding feasts, religious celebrations, and harvest festivals could become disasters if the food was contaminated. The social bonds that made peasant communities strong also made them vulnerable to collective food poisoning. The knowledge gaps that existed around food safety were enormous and dangerous. People didn't understand the bacterial causes of food poisoning and often attributed illness to supernatural causes. This led to ineffective prevention strategies and delayed treatment. The empirical knowledge that peasants developed about food safety was often accurate but incomplete. They knew what worked, but not why it worked. The economic pressures that forced people to eat dangerous foods were cruel and constant. During times of scarcity, people would eat foods they knew were risky rather than starve. Spoiled grain might be consumed because it was the only food available. The choice between probable illness and certain starvation was a horrible reality for many peasants. Economic desperation often overrode food safety concerns. The treatment options for food poisoning were primitive and often ineffective. Medieval medicine had limited understanding of digestive illness and few effective treatments. Herbal remedies sometimes helped but could also make things worse. The lack of effective medical intervention meant that severe food poisoning was often fatal. People who survived serious foodborne illness often suffered long-term health consequences. What's really striking is how these food safety challenges shaped medieval culture and behavior. The constant risk of foodborne illness created elaborate rituals around food preparation and consumption. Religious blessings of food weren't just spiritual practices. They were psychological coping mechanisms for dealing with food safety, anxiety. The social rules around food sharing and hospitality included implicit food safety protocols. The innovation that came out of these food safety challenges was remarkable. Peasants developed sophisticated food testing methods using all their senses. They created preservation techniques that maximize safety while maintaining nutrition. They established food sharing practices that distributed risk across communities. The survival strategies they developed were often more effective than formal food safety regulations. Now we're wrapping up our medieval food journey with what I think is the most fascinating part: how looking at medieval peasant food culture through a modern lens reveals lessons that could actually improve our contemporary eating habits. What absolutely blows my mind is how many of the food practices that medieval peasants developed out of necessity are now being rediscovered by modern nutritionists, sustainability experts, and food scientists. We're talking about people who accidentally created some of the most effective food systems in human history, and we're only now beginning to understand why their approaches were so successful. The medieval peasant table might actually hold keys to solving some of our biggest modern food challenges. The seasonal eating patterns that peasants followed are now recognized as optimal for human health and environmental sustainability. Modern research shows that eating foods when they're naturally in season provides better nutrition, supports local ecosystems, and reduces environmental impact. Peasants ate this way because they had no choice, but we're discovering that their forced seasonality created eating patterns that were perfectly aligned with human biology. The spring detox from winter foods, the summer abundance of fresh produce, and the fall preparation for winter all supported natural metabolic rhythms that modern year-round eating disrupts. The fermented food consumption that was standard in peasant diets is now being hailed as revolutionary for gut health. Modern microbiome research shows that the sauerkraut, fermented dairy, and low-alcohol ales that peasants consumed daily provided probiotics that supported digestive health, immune function, and even mental health. What peasants did for food safety and preservation turns out to have been optimal for human health. Contemporary nutritionists are now recommending the same fermented foods that medieval peasants took for granted. The whole grain consumption that characterized peasant diets is now recognized as superior to the refined grain products that dominate modern diets. The rye, barley, and oat breads that peasants ate provided fiber, nutrients, and complex carbohydrates that support stable blood sugar and digestive health. Modern research on diabetes, obesity, and metabolic disorders consistently shows that whole grain consumption, the peasant standard, is crucial for health. The fancy white bread that wealthy people ate was actually nutritionally inferior to peasant bread. The plant diversity in peasant diets puts modern eating habits to shame. Peasants regularly consumed dozens of different vegetables, herbs, and wild plants that provided a spectrum of nutrients and phytonutrients. Modern research on nutrition shows that dietary diversity is crucial for health, but most contemporary people eat far fewer plant varieties than medieval peasants. The wild plants that peasants foraged often contained higher concentrations of nutrients than cultivated varieties. The sustainable agriculture practices that peasants used are now being rediscovered as solutions to modern environmental problems. Their crop rotation systems, diverse plantings, and integration of animal husbandry created food systems that were environmentally sustainable and resilient. Modern permaculture and regenerative agriculture movements are essentially rediscovering peasant farming methods. The biodiversity that peasant agriculture supported is now recognized as crucial for ecosystem health. The communal eating practices that characterized peasant food culture are now being studied as models for addressing modern social isolation and mental health problems. Research shows that sharing meals strengthens social bonds, reduces stress, and supports psychological well-being. The peasant tradition of communal food preparation and shared meals created social connections that modern individualistic eating has largely lost. Contemporary public health experts are now recommending the same communal eating practices that peasants developed naturally. The food waste minimization that peasants practiced out of necessity is now recognized as crucial for environmental sustainability. Peasants used every part of animals and plants, composted organic waste, and created preservation systems that minimize spoilage. Modern environmental movements are trying to recreate the zero-waste food systems that peasants developed by necessity. Their approach to food waste was far more sustainable than contemporary practices. The local food systems that peasants created are now being promoted as solutions to modern food security and environmental problems. Peasant communities were largely self-sufficient in food production, creating resilient local food systems that could withstand external disruptions. Modern food security experts are now advocating for the same local food networks that peasants developed naturally. The global food system's vulnerability to disruption has made peasant-style local food security look increasingly attractive. The mindful eating practices that peasants developed are now being rediscovered as solutions to modern eating disorders and obesity. Peasants ate slowly, paid attention to seasonal availability, and consumed food in social contexts that promoted healthy eating behaviors. Modern research on mindful eating shows that these practices support healthy weight management and psychological well-being. The peasant approach to food was inherently mindful in ways that modern eating often isn't. The herbal medicine integration that peasants practiced is now being validated by modern research. The herbs and medicinal plants that peasants consumed as part of their regular diet provided health benefits that modern medicine is only beginning to understand. Many contemporary supplements and functional foods are essentially trying to recreate the health benefits that peasants got from their varied, plant-rich diets. Traditional peasant food wisdom often anticipated modern nutritional science. The work-food balance that peasants maintained is now being studied as a model for addressing modern lifestyle diseases. Peasants ate to fuel their physical activity, creating natural balance between calorie consumption and energy expenditure. Modern sedentary lifestyles have disrupted this balance, leading to obesity and metabolic disorders. The peasant model of eating for activity rather than entertainment offers lessons for contemporary health challenges. The food security strategies that peasants developed are now being adapted for modern emergency preparedness. Their preservation techniques, diverse food sources, and community support systems created resilience that modern just-in-time food systems lack. Contemporary emergency preparedness experts are studying peasant food security methods as models for community resilience. What's really striking is how many modern food problems could be addressed by adopting peasant-inspired approaches. The obesity epidemic, environmental degradation, social isolation, and food insecurity that plague modern societies were largely absent from peasant communities. This doesn't mean we should romanticize peasant life. They faced serious challenges we've largely solved. But their food practices offer valuable lessons for creating healthier, more sustainable eating patterns. Looking back at this entire journey through medieval peasant food culture, what strikes me most is how these supposedly primitive people developed food systems that were often superior to modern practices, from their nutritionally diverse diets to their sustainable agriculture to their social eating practices. Peasants created food cultures that supported both human health and environmental sustainability. They faced real dangers and challenges that we've largely overcome, but their solutions to fundamental food challenges remain relevant today. The next time you eat a fermented food, choose seasonal produce, or share a meal with friends, remember that you're participating in traditions that medieval peasants perfected centuries ago, and that modern science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. Sweet dreams, and thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through medieval peasant life, from their resourceful travel survival to their innovative clothing adaptations to their surprisingly sophisticated food culture. These stories remind us that human creativity, resilience, and community spirit can turn even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for innovation and connection.